You know what's crazy? In 1952, a mechanic walked into a NASCAR inspection bay with a car that was about to change racing forever. Except nobody knew it yet. The inspectors did their usual checks, measurements, calculations. Everything looked fine. Everything seemed normal. They signed off on the vehicle, approved it for competition, sent the driver on his way. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't have possibly realized, was that they were looking at a machine built by someone who thought about rules completely differently than they did. This wasn't just another race car. This was a philosophy on wheels, a moving testament to the idea that written regulations are just the starting point of a negotiation, not the end of one. And the man who built it, well, he was about to spend the next 3 decades making some of the smartest technical inspectors in American motorsport look like they were playing checkers while he was playing three-dimensional chess. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the boundary between innovation and rule-breaking in competitive motorsports. If you're someone who loves stories about engineering genius, creative thinking, and the colorful characters who changed racing history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, we're going to talk about Smokey Yunick today, and I know some of you already know that name. You've heard the stories, the legends, the almost mythological tales of fuel tanks and basketballs and inspectors standing around scratching their heads. But here's the thing, most of what gets told about Smokey is just the highlights, the greatest hits compilation. What I want to do is go deeper, to understand not just what he did, but how he thought, why his approach worked, and what it tells us about competition, rules, and human ingenuity. Because Smokey wasn't just a guy who cheated at NASCAR. That's the surface level understanding. The reality is so much more interesting than that. Henry Yunick, Smokey was a nickname that came later, was born on May 25, 1923 in Neshaminy Falls, Pennsylvania. Now, before we get into the racing stuff, before we talk about modified fuel systems and shrunk cars and all the technical wizardry, we need to understand something about who this guy was fundamentally. Because the racing stuff, that all flows from character, from personality, from a particular way of seeing the world. And Smokey's worldview was shaped by experiences that had nothing to do with cars, at least initially. Before Smokey ever touched a NASCAR vehicle, before he ever opened his legendary garage in Daytona Beach, he was flying B-17 bombers over Nazi Germany. World War II, 17 combat missions, the kind of experience that changes a person's relationship with risk forever. Now, I mention this not just as biographical detail, but because it's actually crucial to understanding everything that came after. When you've flown bombing runs over occupied Europe, when you've dealt with that level of danger, that level of uncertainty, the threat of NASCAR inspectors catching you with an illegal fuel system doesn't really register as scary. Risk becomes just another factor to calculate, another variable to manage. Fear stops being a deterrent and becomes just information. After the war, Smokey settled in Daytona Beach, Florida, and the timing here is really important. This is 1946, 1947, and Daytona Beach is the epicenter of American speed culture. The beach itself had been used for land speed record attempts since the 1920s. People like Malcolm Campbell and Henry Seagrave had pushed the boundaries of automotive performance on that very sand. Racing was literally built into the geography of the place. It was in the culture, in the local economy, and the collective imagination of everyone who lived there. If you were interested in making cars go fast, Daytona Beach in the late 1940s was exactly where you wanted to be. In 1947, Smokey opened his garage on Beach Street. Just a small operation initially, basic repair work, some performance modifications, the kind of thing you'd expect from a competent mechanic with an interest in speed. But this garage, this unassuming building on Beach Street, would operate for the next 54 years and become one of the most famous automotive workshops in American history. Drivers would make pilgrimages there, journalists would write about it, and NASCAR inspectors would probably wake up in cold sweats thinking about what might be happening inside those walls at any given moment. Now, here's where things get really interesting. NASCAR was founded in 1948, just 1 year after Smokey opened his garage. Think about that timing. The sanctioning body was brand new. The rule structure was primitive, the inspection processes were basic, and the whole enterprise had this Wild West, anything goes kind of energy to it. Perfect conditions for someone like Smokey Yunick, someone who looked at new rule structures and saw not limitations but opportunities. See, NASCAR in the late 1940s and early 1950s was trying to create order out of chaos. Stock car racing had existed before NASCAR, but it was scattered, disorganized, inconsistent. Different tracks had different rules, different safety standards, different everything. Bill France Sr., NASCAR's founder, wanted to create a unified structure, a consistent set of regulations that would make the sport more professional, more legitimate, more attractive to sponsors and fans. Noble goal, absolutely, but here's what most people don't realize. Every new rule structure, no matter how well-intentioned, contains gaps, loopholes, places where the language says one thing but could be interpreted another way, places where the rule exists but the enforcement mechanism doesn't. And Smokey Yunick had an absolutely supernatural ability to find these places. His philosophy was simple, elegant, and consistently applied throughout his entire career. If the rule book didn't specifically prohibit something, then it was legal. Period. And if the rulebook did prohibit something but didn't explain exactly how they would check for compliance, well, that was basically an invitation to get creative. This wasn't just rationalization, though I'm sure that was part of it. This was a genuine philosophical position about how rules work, about the relationship between written regulations and practical reality. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's just justification for cheating, right? That's just a guy telling himself that bending the rules isn't really wrong. And look, there's probably some truth to that, but it's also more complex than simple dishonesty. Smokey genuinely believed that innovation meant finding solutions that others hadn't thought of, and if those solutions happened to exploit gaps in the regulations, that was the rule writer's problem, not his. He saw himself not as someone breaking the rules, but as someone showing where the rules were incomplete. To understand why Smokey became such an absolute legend in racing circles, you have to understand what NASCAR's technical inspection process was actually like in the 1950s and 1960s. And honestly, by modern standards, it was kind of primitive. Inspectors would check basic specifications: engine displacement, wheelbase dimensions, vehicle weight, fuel capacity, things like that. But the tools they had were limited. Tape measures, mechanical scales, visual inspections. They didn't have computer analysis. They didn't have sophisticated measuring equipment. They didn't have the kind of technology that modern racing inspectors take for granted. They were relying on human judgment and basic tools to verify compliance with technical regulations. And Smokey was operating on a completely different intellectual level. The basketball trick? Oh man, the basketball trick. This is probably Smokey's single most famous innovation, the one that gets mentioned in every article, every documentary, every bar conversation about NASCAR history. And the reason it's so famous is that it's just perfect. It's simple, it's elegant, it's completely unexpected, and it shows exactly how Smokey thought about problems. So let me walk you through how this worked, because the details matter. NASCAR had strict regulations about fuel tank capacity. Every car was limited to a specific number of gallons. I think it was around 22 gallons at the time, though the exact number varied. The logic was sound. They wanted to level the playing field, to make sure that nobody could simply carry more fuel than their competitors and make fewer pit stops. Pit stop strategy was supposed to be part of the competition, and unlimited fuel capacity would eliminate that element. Fair enough, right? Totally reasonable regulation. But Smokey looked at this rule and thought about it differently. The regulation specified tank capacity, and NASCAR inspectors measured tank capacity during the pre-race inspection. They would literally put fuel into the tank, measure how much it held, verify that it didn't exceed the maximum. Standard procedure. But what if, and this is the key insight, what if the tank's capacity during inspection was different than its capacity during the actual race? What if you could temporarily reduce the tank's volume, pass inspection, and then restore it to a larger size afterward? This is where the basketball comes in. Before inspection, Smokey would take a basketball, deflate it slightly, and insert it through the fuel tank's filler neck. Now, a basketball is bigger than a filler neck opening, obviously, but rubber is flexible. With the right technique, you could compress it, work it through the opening, and then once inside the tank, it would expand back to its normal size. So now you've got this basketball sitting inside the fuel tank, taking up space, maybe a gallon or more depending on the size of the ball. The inspectors would arrive, do their measurement, pour fuel into the tank until it was full. The tank would hold exactly the regulation amount, say 22 gallons, because the basketball was displacing volume. Everything would check out perfectly. The inspectors would sign off, approve the car for competition, move on to the next vehicle. And then after they left, Smokey would reach into the tank, deflate the basketball, and pull it out through the filler neck. Suddenly, magically, the car had an extra gallon or more of fuel capacity. The tank that held 22 gallons during inspection now held 23 or 24 gallons during the race. Think about the advantage this provided. In a long race, one fewer pit stop could mean the difference between winning and finishing mid-pack. Pit stops take time, at least 20 to 30 seconds, even when everything goes perfectly, often longer. If you can run the entire race on one fewer stop than your competitors, you've just gained potentially half a minute or more. In a sport where races are often decided by seconds, this is enormous. And the beauty of it, the absolute genius of it, was the simplicity. Smokey wasn't using exotic materials or complex engineering. He was using a basketball, something you could buy at any sporting goods store for a few dollars. The innovation wasn't in the technology, it was in the thinking, in seeing a possibility that nobody else had considered. Now, the basketball trick is the famous one, the one that everybody knows. But here's what most people don't realize. It was just one innovation among dozens. Smokey's garage was basically a laboratory for rule exploitation, constantly experimenting, constantly finding new approaches, new angles, new ways to gain advantages that the inspectors couldn't detect or couldn't prove. And some of these other innovations were just as clever as the basketball, maybe even more so. There was the famous 7/8 scale car, and this one is wild. NASCAR regulations specified that race cars had to be based on production vehicles. They had to maintain the same basic dimensions, the same proportions as the cars you could buy at a dealership. The logic was that this was stock car racing. The vehicles should be recognizably related to actual stock automobiles. Made sense as a concept. Smokey built a car that was exactly 7/8 the size of the production version. Same shape, same proportions, every dimension just scaled down by exactly 12.5%. And the reason this mattered was aerodynamics. A smaller car has less frontal area, which means less aerodynamic drag, which means higher top speed on the straightaways. Not a huge difference maybe, but enough to matter in a close race. The inspectors would look at this car and it looked right. The proportions were correct, the shape matched the production vehicle, but the entire thing was smaller. And here's the thing, the rules didn't actually specify that the car had to be full size. They specified proportions, relationships between dimensions, but not absolute measurements in the way you'd need to catch this trick. Smokey had found another gap, another place where the regulations said one thing but could be read another way. According to the stories, and some of these are definitely embellished over the years, but according to the stories, this car competed in multiple races before NASCAR caught on. And even when they did catch on, the question became, what rule exactly had been violated? If the proportions were correct and the rules specified proportions, was this actually illegal? NASCAR ended up having to write new regulations specifically to address this, specifying absolute dimensions in addition to proportional relationships. Smokey had forced them to make their rules more comprehensive. The fuel line trick was another masterpiece of lateral thinking, and this one shows how Smokey approached problems from angles that nobody else considered. NASCAR regulated fuel tank capacity, we've covered that, but here's what the rule writers hadn't thought about carefully enough. What about the fuel delivery system itself? The lines that carried gasoline from the tank to the engine. Those weren't part of the tank, technically speaking. They were a separate system, subject to different regulations, or in this case, almost no regulations at all. Standard fuel lines in race cars of that era were maybe a 1/4 inch in diameter, small tubes designed to deliver fuel efficiently without taking up unnecessary space or adding unnecessary weight. Smokey looked at this and saw an opportunity. He ran fuel lines that were 2 inches in diameter, massive tubes, big enough to stick your arm through, connecting the fuel tank to the engine compartment. These oversized lines could hold an extra gallon of fuel all by themselves, maybe more depending on the total length of the routing. The inspectors would measure the fuel tank, confirm it met specifications, and never think to measure the fuel lines. Why would they? Fuel lines were just fuel lines, right? Nobody had ever tried to use them as auxiliary fuel storage before, but Smokey had, and it worked beautifully. The car passed inspection with a legal fuel tank while carrying significantly more total fuel capacity than regulations intended. Here's where it gets really interesting though. The air intake modification that Smokey developed for Daytona showed an even more sophisticated level of systems thinking. He showed up with a car featuring an enormous air intake on the hood, way bigger than anything the other teams were running. The inspectors were immediately suspicious. This thing looked strange. It looked like it was designed to do something other than just channel air to the engine. But they couldn't figure out what rule it violated. Air intakes weren't regulated in terms of size, and this one didn't seem to be doing anything obviously illegal. What they didn't realize was that this intake connected to a sealed compartment hidden within the car's bodywork. This compartment could hold additional fuel, completely separate from the primary fuel tank. During the pace laps, when the car was circulating at reduced speed and the engine wasn't under full load, a system would transfer fuel from the main tank into this hidden reservoir. Then, during the actual race, as fuel was consumed from the primary tank, the hidden fuel would feed back into the main system. The car essentially had two fuel tanks. Only one of them was ever inspected. The other one was disguised as an aerodynamic component, hiding in plain sight. This level of integration, this ability to make illegal components look like legal ones, that was what separated Smokey from ordinary cheaters. He wasn't just breaking rules, he was designing systems where the rule violations were architecturally invisible. There's a story that gets told in racing circles. And look, I can't verify every detail, some of this might be embellished over the decades, but the essence of it captures something true about how Smokey operated. Supposedly, at one inspection, NASCAR officials found 9 separate rule violations on Smokey's car. 9. They went through the vehicle systematically, removing illegal components, confiscating parts, basically stripping the car of everything they'd identified as non-compliant. When they finally handed the car back to Smokey, he climbed in, started the engine, and drove away. The inspectors just stood there, completely confused. They had removed the fuel delivery system. The car shouldn't have been able to run at all. But Smokey had built redundant systems they hadn't found, hidden fuel delivery mechanisms that bypassed everything they'd confiscated. He drove that car right out of the inspection bay, essentially demonstrating that no matter how thorough they thought they'd been, he was still one step ahead. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't NASCAR just ban him? Why tolerate this guy who was so obviously making a mockery of their technical regulations? And this is where the story gets more nuanced than simple rule breaking. First, catching Smokey was actually difficult. Really difficult. He was smarter than the inspection process, and proving a violation required finding it first. You can't penalize someone for cheating if you can't demonstrate what they did wrong. Many of Smokey's innovations were discovered only years later, sometimes decades later, when he would tell the stories himself. During the actual races, the inspectors often couldn't prove anything. Second, and this is crucial, Smokey was good for NASCAR in complicated ways. He was a character, a personality, the kind of colorful figure that makes sports interesting and attracts media attention. The ongoing battle between Smokey and the inspectors was itself a narrative, a storyline that fans followed and enjoyed. Racing needs heroes, but it also needs rogues, anti-heroes, figures who operate outside the normal boundaries while remaining somehow sympathetic. Third, Smokey's innovations actually improved the sport over time. Every trick he invented led to a new rule. Every loophole he exploited got closed. The inspection process became more sophisticated specifically because it had to evolve to catch him. In a strange way, Smokey was like a security consultant who finds vulnerabilities by exploiting them, forcing the system to become more robust. Bill France Sr., NASCAR's founder, apparently had complicated feelings about Smokey. On one level, this guy was undermining the integrity of technical regulations that France had worked hard to establish. But on another level, there was grudging respect for the cleverness, the audacity, the sheer creative intelligence on display. And Smokey was undeniably good for business. People talked about him, wrote about him, showed up at races partly hoping to see what he would try next. The relationship between Smokey and NASCAR officials developed this weird quality over time. Adversarial, but also almost affectionate, like a chess match between opponents who respect each other's abilities. The inspectors who failed to catch his tricks would sometimes laugh about it afterward, acknowledging that they'd been outmaneuvered by someone genuinely smarter than them. It was a game, and everyone kind of understood it was a game, and Smokey was simply the best player anyone had ever seen. Here's the thing though, and this is important. Smokey wasn't just about creative rule bending. The man was a genuinely brilliant engineer whose innovations extended far beyond motorsport. He held over 40 patents during his lifetime, covering everything from fuel injection systems to turbocharging technologies to engine efficiency improvements. Major automotive manufacturers consulted with him. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, these companies sent engineers to Smokey's garage to learn from him, to pick his brain about problems they were struggling to solve. The fuel tank tricks and the scaled-down cars, those are the stories that get repeated because they're entertaining. But underneath those stories was real engineering talent, the kind of systematic technical thinking that produces genuine innovation. Smokey understood thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, material science, aerodynamics. He understood these things at a level that few people in racing could match, and he applied that understanding both to legitimate technical advancement and to finding competitive advantages that the rules didn't anticipate. Let me give you an example that shows the legitimate innovation side. In the early 1970s, Smokey developed something he called the hot vapor engine. The concept was relatively straightforward in theory, but extremely difficult to implement in practice. The idea was to preheat the air-fuel mixture before it entered the combustion chambers using waste heat from the engine itself. Now, internal combustion engines produce enormous amounts of waste heat. The cooling system exists specifically to remove this heat before it damages the engine. Most of that thermal energy just gets dumped into the atmosphere, completely wasted. Smokey's insight was that this waste heat could be captured and used to vaporize the fuel more completely before combustion, improving efficiency and power output simultaneously. He claimed fuel economy improvements that seemed almost impossible at the time, numbers that made automotive engineers skeptical. Some of his specific claims were never independently verified, and there's ongoing debate about exactly how effective the hot vapor system actually was in practice. But the fundamental concept was sound engineering that anticipated developments in automotive technology by decades. Modern engines use various forms of heat recovery and thermal management that echo what Smokey was working on in the early 1970s. He also worked extensively on turbocharging systems during a period when forced induction was relatively uncommon in American motorsport. Turbochargers use exhaust gas energy to compress incoming air, allowing engines to produce more power without increasing displacement. Today, this technology is everywhere, but in the 1960s and 1970s, Smokey was pushing boundaries that most racing teams weren't even approaching. The man was genuinely ahead of his time in multiple technical domains. The cheating stories overshadowed this legitimate work, which is understandable because the cheating stories are more fun to tell. But you can't fully understand Smokey Yunick without recognizing that the same intelligence that found loopholes in NASCAR regulations also produced genuine engineering breakthroughs that advanced automotive technology. His garage on Beach Street in Daytona became something like a pilgrimage site for racing enthusiasts. People would drive from across the country just to visit, to meet Smokey, to hear his stories firsthand, to maybe catch a glimpse of whatever project he was working on. Young mechanics who dreamed of careers in motorsport would show up hoping to learn something, to absorb some of the knowledge that this legendary figure had accumulated over decades. And Smokey, despite his reputation for being difficult and cantankerous, seems to have enjoyed these interactions. He was generous with his technical knowledge, willing to explain his thinking to people who were genuinely interested. He wrote extensively for Hot Rod magazine and other automotive publications, sharing insights and techniques that helped educate a generation of mechanics and enthusiasts. He published an autobiography that became something of a Bible for people interested in the intersection of engineering creativity and competitive motorsport. The cultural significance of Smokey extended beyond just racing circles. He represented something in American mythology: the lone genius in his garage, the clever underdog outsmarting institutional authority, the individual who wins through pure intelligence rather than resources. This is a deeply American archetype, the same energy that surrounds stories about inventors and entrepreneurs, and people who built empires from nothing through sheer creative force. Smokey was doing this in a specific context, competitive motorsport, but the underlying narrative resonated with broader cultural values. There's something satisfying about watching someone beat the system through cleverness, about seeing bureaucratic authority outmaneuvered by individual brilliance. Even people who thought what Smokey did was technically wrong often found themselves admiring how he did it. The drivers who worked with Smokey understood what they were getting into. Fireball Roberts, one of NASCAR's early superstars, drove Smokey's cars to multiple victories. Herb Thomas, another legendary name from the sport's formative years, achieved success in Smokey-prepared vehicles. These weren't innocent drivers being tricked into competing with illegal equipment. They were willing participants in the game, collaborators who understood that driving for Smokey meant having access to advantages that other teams couldn't match. And the advantages were real. Smokey's cars won races, lots of them. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, vehicles that came out of that Beach Street garage performed at a level that competitors struggled to match. Some of that performance came from legitimate engineering excellence. Some of it came from finding gaps in the technical regulations. From the outside, from the grandstands, it was impossible to know which was which. The cars were just faster, and that's what mattered in the results sheet. The inspection cat-and-mouse game became increasingly sophisticated as the years went on. NASCAR kept refining their procedures, developing better tools, training their inspectors more thoroughly. And Smokey kept adapting, finding new angles, new approaches that the enhanced inspection process still couldn't catch. It was an arms race, and for a long time, Smokey stayed ahead. But the sport was changing around him. By the 1970s, NASCAR was becoming more professional, more corporate, more serious about its image. Major manufacturers were investing significant resources into racing programs. The era of independent operators running on shoestring budgets and outrageous creativity was giving way to factory-backed teams with engineering departments and quality control processes. The inspection technology improved dramatically. Electronic measuring equipment replaced tape measures. Computer analysis supplemented human judgment. The rulebook expanded from a few pages to hundreds, attempting to close every loophole that anyone had ever found. The gray areas that Smokey had exploited so brilliantly were slowly being eliminated, filled in with specific language that left less room for creative interpretation. Smokey adapted to some extent, but there's a limit to how much adaptation is possible when the fundamental conditions changed this dramatically. His greatest advantages had come from being smarter than the inspection process, from thinking about problems in ways that the rule writers hadn't anticipated. As the inspection process got more sophisticated, as more people started thinking about potential exploits and building rules to prevent them, the opportunities for creative rule bending diminished. He gradually stepped back from active racing involvement during this period, focusing more on his engineering work, his patents, his consulting relationships with major manufacturers. The legendary garage continued operating, but Smokey's role shifted from active competitor to elder statesman, from rule bender to historian of rule bending, telling stories about the old days to anyone who wanted to listen. The transition into the 1980s marked something interesting in Smokey's career trajectory. Here was a guy who had built his entire reputation on making cars go faster at any cost, on finding every possible advantage regardless of fuel consumption or efficiency. Racing in his era was about raw power, about squeezing every last horsepower out of an engine without worrying about how much gasoline it burned. But as he aged, as the automotive world changed around him, Smokey became increasingly focused on exactly the opposite problem. How to make engines more efficient, how to get more miles per gallon, how to reduce the environmental impact of internal combustion. Some people saw this as contradictory, even hypocritical. The guy who spent decades finding ways to carry extra fuel was now obsessed with using less of it? But if you understood how Smokey actually thought, it made perfect sense. He had always been about optimization, about finding better solutions than the obvious ones. In the 1950s and 1960s, the optimization target was speed and competitive advantage. By the 1980s, with fuel crises and environmental concerns reshaping the automotive landscape, the optimization target had shifted to efficiency. Same intellectual approach, different problem to solve. He spent considerable time during this later period working on engine designs that he believed could revolutionize fuel economy. Some of these projects attracted serious interest from major manufacturers. Others remained theoretical, concepts that were technically sound but never achieved commercial implementation. The automotive industry is conservative in many ways, slow to adopt radical new approaches, even when the engineering makes sense. Smokey's ideas were often too far ahead of where the industry was willing to go. There's something poignant about this phase of his career. The racing world had moved on, the inspection battles were behind him, but that restless engineering mind kept working on problems, kept seeking innovations, kept pushing against limitations. He couldn't stop thinking about how to make things better, even when the specific context of competitive racing no longer applied. His workshop remained active throughout the 1980s and 1990s, though the nature of the work changed. Less race preparation, more experimental engineering, fewer drivers showing up to pick up competition vehicles, more engineers and journalists coming to discuss ideas and collect stories. Smokey had become a living archive of racing history, a primary source for anyone researching the wild early days of NASCAR. And he was surprisingly willing to talk about his rule-bending innovations, at least once enough time had passed. Stories that would have gotten him banned during his active career became entertainment decades later. He would describe the basketball trick with evident pride, explaining exactly how it worked to audiences who couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. The inspectors who had failed to catch these innovations were mostly retired or dead by then, so there was no one left to embarrass except in historical terms. The relationship between Smokey and the racing establishment evolved into something almost warm during these later years. NASCAR invited him to events, honored his contributions to the sport, treated him as a founding figure rather than a problem to be solved. The same organization that had spent decades trying to catch him cheating now celebrated him as a legend. There's irony there, but also recognition that Smokey had been part of building something, even if his methods were unconventional. Let me talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough, the philosophical implications of what Smokey did, because there's a real question here about the nature of rules and competition that extends far beyond motorsport. Every competitive system relies on rules to create fair conditions. Without rules, competition becomes chaotic, potentially dangerous, ultimately meaningless. But rules are always imperfect approximations of intent. The people who write rules are trying to anticipate every possible situation, every potential exploit, every creative interpretation that might undermine their goals. This is functionally impossible. Language is imprecise, situations are infinite, and human creativity will always find gaps that rule writers couldn't imagine. So what do you do when someone finds those gaps? One response is to call it cheating, to argue that violating the spirit of the rules is wrong even when the letter of the rules technically permits it. This is the conventional view, and it has moral weight. Competition depends on good faith participation, on everyone agreeing to pursue victory within understood boundaries, even when those boundaries aren't perfectly specified. But there's another perspective, one that Smokey embodied throughout his career. If the rules are imperfect, if gaps exist, then finding and exploiting those gaps is itself a form of competition. The rule writers had their chance to anticipate problems and close loopholes. If they failed, that's on them. The competitor's job is to win within whatever framework actually exists, not whatever framework someone intended to create. This second perspective has a kind of purity to it, a ruthless, logical consistency, and it's not entirely without practical justification. As I mentioned earlier, Smokey's exploits forced NASCAR to improve their technical regulations. Every trick he found led to a new rule. The system got better because he kept revealing its weaknesses. You could argue that he was performing a valuable service, stress testing the regulatory framework and identifying vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. Modern technology industries operate on a similar principle. Companies hire hackers to find security vulnerabilities before malicious actors can exploit them. These white hat hackers break into systems not to cause damage, but to reveal weaknesses that can then be fixed. Smokey was doing something analogous, though his motivations were competitive advantage rather than security improvement. But here's the counter-argument. This framing lets rule breakers off too easily. Smokey wasn't trying to improve NASCAR's technical regulations. He was trying to win races through means that the regulations were designed to prevent. The fact that his cheating had positive side effects doesn't make it not cheating. You don't get moral credit for the unintended consequences of selfish actions. I find myself genuinely uncertain about where to come down on this. The stories are entertaining, Smokey is a compelling character, and there's something admirable about the sheer intelligence and creativity he brought to these problems. But entertainment value and moral correctness aren't the same thing. Lots of people who do wrong things are interesting and clever. What I keep coming back to is the question of harm. Who was actually hurt by Smokey's innovations? Other competitors, obviously, who lost races they might have won if everyone had been operating under the same constraints. Fans who believed they were watching fair competition when some participants had hidden advantages. The integrity of the sport itself, which depends on rules meaning something. But the harm was relatively contained. Nobody was physically injured by Smokey's fuel system modifications. The financial stakes, while significant to the participants, weren't life-changing amounts in the way that modern racing purses are. And the competitive disadvantage to other teams was partially offset by the fact that everyone knew Smokey was probably doing something, they just couldn't prove what. It was an open secret that shaped expectations and strategies throughout the field. Compare this to cheating scandals in other contexts. Performance-enhancing drugs in athletics cause long-term health damage to users and create pressure for others to damage themselves to stay competitive. Financial fraud destroys families and institutions. Academic cheating undermines the value of credentials that people have legitimately earned. Smokey's rule bending, by comparison, seems almost quaint. He was carrying extra fuel and driving slightly smaller cars, not destroying lives or institutions. Maybe that's why the racing world ultimately embraced him rather than condemning him. The stakes were low enough that the cleverness could be appreciated without being overshadowed by genuine harm. It's easier to find the cheater charming when the cheating doesn't really hurt anyone that badly. Or maybe the explanation is simpler. People love a good story, and Smokey was an incredible story. The basketball in the fuel tank, the 7/8 scale car, the hidden fuel reservoirs, the inspectors standing around confused while Smokey drove away in a car they thought they'd disabled. These stories are just inherently compelling, regardless of their moral implications. We're drawn to cleverness, to audacity, to people who beat systems through pure intelligence. Smokey gave us all of that in abundance. The final years of Smokey's life were quieter than the legendary racing years, but they weren't inactive. He continued working in his garage, continued tinkering with engine designs and efficiency improvements, continued holding court for the steady stream of visitors who wanted to meet the man behind the legends. His mind never stopped working on problems, never stopped seeking better solutions. Health declined gradually, as it does. The physical demands of garage work became harder to meet. But the stories kept flowing, the visitors kept coming, the legend kept growing. By the time Smokey died on May 9, 2001, just 16 days before what would have been his 78th birthday, he had achieved something remarkable. He had become more famous for breaking rules than most people become for following them. His garage on Beach Street closed shortly after his death, ending a 54-year run that had seen the entire arc of American motorsport evolution. The building was eventually demolished, replaced by development that shows no trace of what once happened there. But the stories survive, passed down through racing communities, retold in documentaries and articles and conversations at tracks around the world. The institutional recognition came eventually, as it often does once enough time has passed for controversy to fade into history. Smokey was inducted into the International Motorsports Hall of Fame, acknowledging his contributions to racing despite, or perhaps because of, his unconventional methods. The Stock Car Racing Hall of Fame honored him. The Motorcycle Hall of Fame recognized his work in that domain as well. The establishments that had spent decades trying to catch him ultimately decided he belonged in their pantheon of greats. There's a lesson somewhere in all of this about how legacy works, about how time transforms perception. The rule violations that once threatened to get Smokey banned became, with sufficient historical distance, evidence of genius that deserves celebration. The cat-and-mouse games with inspectors became colorful anecdotes rather than serious infractions. The cheating became innovation. The violations became creativity. The problems became stories. Maybe this is how it always works with figures who operate at the boundaries of acceptable behavior. In the moment, they're threats to order and fairness. In retrospect, they're characters who made history more interesting. The passage of time files down the sharp edges of transgression and leaves behind only the entertaining contours. Or maybe Smokey was genuinely different from ordinary cheaters, operating at a level of intelligence and creativity that earned him a different kind of evaluation. Not every rule breaker becomes a legend. Most are just forgotten, their violations unremarkable enough that history doesn't bother to record them. Smokey's innovations were so clever, so unexpected, so far beyond what anyone else was doing that they transcended mere cheating and became something else. Art, perhaps, or engineering poetry. The automotive world he helped shape continues evolving in directions he anticipated. Efficiency matters more than ever. Emissions regulations constrain engine design in ways that would have been unimaginable in the 1950s. The Wild West days of racing are long gone, replaced by corporate professionalism and technological sophistication. Modern NASCAR inspection processes would catch Smokey's old tricks in seconds, and the penalties for violations are severe enough to make the risk-reward calculation completely different. But the spirit of creative problem-solving that Smokey embodied hasn't disappeared. Engineers still look for advantages, still push boundaries, still find interpretations of rules that the rule writers didn't anticipate. The specific techniques change, but the underlying dynamic remains. Regulations try to constrain, and human ingenuity tries to escape those constraints. It's been happening as long as organized competition has existed, and it will continue as long as humans compete with each other for anything. Smokey Yunick was an extreme example of something fundamental about human nature. We don't accept limits easily. We look for ways around obstacles, through them, over them. We solve problems by redefining what the problem actually is. We find opportunities where others see only walls.